The legacy of Paul Kurtz, which I'm going to talk briefly about, is right here in this room. Is with people who've been moved by this man and his variety of skills. I spent my life with academics, and I've never known anyone quite like Paul. He could, of course, do research. He could, of course, write. He could, of course, communicate it. But he could also build organizations. He could also buy land on the edge of the university. He could also build a printing press, on and on and on. He could be a major officer in both national organizations and international organizations. He could organize dialogues around the world. And he could write beautiful manifestos, and he could remind himself continually that you've got to find words that communicate. I was trying to think of something I could say that would even imitate Paul, and it would be that humanists have to know about yesterday so that today they can build better tomorrows. Maybe that's too simple. Paul would say, what about eupraxiphy? And people would say, what? And then he could go on. Or when people began, and of course this is how it started when I first met Paul, they're going to call secular humanism the terrible thing that takes over the country. I'm a secular humanist. Why not? Later on, people use the word queer the same way. And in your face, not quite in your face, but saying, do you really mean this is bad? Do you really understand it? Let me tell you about it. At one point, maybe some of you don't know this, we were having great trouble producing the third humanist manifesto. And Paul, in his frustration, started to write it, and other organizations said, we have the copyright, and we had some negotiations with lawyers. Eventually, Paul said, okay, I'll call mine planetary. And so what was going to be a third manifesto out of Buffalo became a planetary manifesto. And more recently, after Paul left Buffalo, in an organizational sense, it became a neo-humanist. Now, why use different words? To catch people's attention on the one hand, but maybe to say things in a new way where the old way doesn't fully communicate. I was just looking at several things. By the way, the website paulkurtz.net is superb because, among other things, it talks about Paul's long career, cites the number of his books, and it lists the neo-humanist statement. But there are a couple things, let me just quote them because Paul did it so beautifully. Aspire to be more inclusive by appealing to both non-religious and religious humanists, and to religious believers who share common goals. If values are the thing that unites us, we have to find those who are willing to work with those values, willing to strengthen them, and find ways of negating the negators of those values, and move ahead. Or Paul said, we're committed to a key set of values: happiness, creative actualization, reason in harmony with emotion, quality, and excellence. Now, those are ordinary words, but put together in a way that they become memorable. More and more, as we watch the context in which we humanists operate, particularly in the United States now, take progressive positions on the economy. Paul was using that word, tricky word, progressive, liberal, neoliberal, what words do we use? And then this is Paul saying, okay, now we've marched together this far, but let's think a little more philosophically. His final statement in this 16 principles of neo-humanism hold that humanity needs to move beyond egocentric individualism and chauvinistic nationalism, boy, that's America today, to develop transnationally planetary institutions to cope with global problems. Such efforts include a strengthened world court, an eventual world parliament, and a planetary environmental monitoring agency that would set standards for controlling global warming and ecology. Now that's eupraxiphy in just a few words. It's understandable, it's grabbable, it's unambiguous, and it's Paul Kurtz. His legacy is here. His legacy is what we can put on the web, what we can remind people. They can hear Paul on the web, they can read him. Maybe they just read this, but maybe it leads them to one of his books and his reminders about that risky word in American life. At one point we used to say, well, Emerson's transcendentalism moved us out of Puritanism and out of the early Boston establishment. What about the transcendental temptation? What's that? And Paul was able to put his finger on that years ago before most of us were ready to say, I even want to read Emerson. So that catching yesterday, the selected parts of yesterday, and then translating them into today to improve tomorrow, that was Paul, that is Paul, that's the humanist movement that he, more than almost anyone else, helped create and strengthen and enlarge.
Now I'd like to introduce you to Charles Murn. Charles is going to speak to us for a little bit about the Human Prospect. He so graciously took over as our editor, I think last June. Charles?
Another legacy of Paul Kurtz is the journal that is published by ISHVI. It's, of course, titled The Human Prospect, a Neo-Humanist Perspective, which I think shows that it ties well into his legacy overall. The journal is a scholarly and professional journal. Paul Kurtz intended it to fulfill the niche of advancing society's understanding of the juncture of science and values in the form of humanist ethics. It is an interdisciplinary peer-reviewed journal. It's published 3 times a year. The journal's content is available online and indexed on Academic Search Complete. The journal's mission is refinement of humanist values and ethics, as well as development of humanist organizing to foster those values and ethics throughout society. The journal seeks contributions addressing the tasks of, among others, 1, understanding the implications of current scientific discoveries for daily life. 2, discerning how refinements in naturalistic epistemology support or compel refinement of specific humanist values. 3, with the tools of reason and scientific evidence, deriving pluralistic ethical rules from humanist values. And 4, framing humanism in all its facets for maximizing the effectiveness of efforts to educate non-humanists about humanism. Accordingly, the journal focuses on publishing articles in philosophy and ethics, sociology and demography, education, medicine, psychology, public policy, and marketing. The journal invites submissions of queries and articles from scholars, academics, and professionals in those fields and other fields as well. ISHVI especially urges humanist academics to submit contributions to the journal so that the journal can gain additional acceptance and recognition from their peers. The journal also publishes narratives and reviews that offer a humanist perspective on personal experiences, planetary culture, the arts and humanities, and the media. As the ancient Greek humanist Protagoras pointed out, not only the philosophers, but also the maid who fetches water may have profound insight into human existence. Of course, back then the maid would have been a slave, so we'll put that part aside. But quite simply, Protagoras was pointing out that personal experiences shed light on humanist values and ethics in practical ways. The importance of articles falling within that realm can't be overstated. I would say that in these articles, the authors are sharing instances of self-realization propounded by humanist psychologist Abraham Maslow. For these reasons, the journal allocates space for them in each issue. Some of our most important contributions are those that connect people through their common experiences. So we urge all of you to take part as authors and readers. This is an example of the journal. This is the current issue. It's available, if you're interested, on one of the book tables. You can subscribe on a form in the back of the copy, or as well on the membership form, which is in this brochure. The top of the two forms involves your option, or describes your options for subscriptions. If you don't want to be a member, you can, of course, join and get the journal as a complimentary feature of membership if you join ISHVI, which of course would be the best option. And finally, there's also a separate form that you might find up there that has options for both subscribing and joining as well. So how do you describe the juncture between science and human values? How do you derive those ethics? The first two issues that have come out since I've become editor, I've contributed a couple of articles, partly because work hadn't been done recruiting authors for some time, so we needed material. So, but also simply because I have things to contribute, and the approach that I take in those two articles is sort of the basis for a paper that I'm working on that I'm describing now. It's essentially a methodology for doing what I mentioned, getting those ethics out of those human values and scientific knowledge. So I'll give a brief overview of it. And in doing so, I would point out that I'm old school in terms of philosophy, so I recognize the distinction between ethics and morals. Morals, in my usage, correspond to sort of the public ethics, the law, the culture and custom that your friends and neighbors enforce on you, and that you enforce on your friends and neighbors, family, etc. And finally, an example of which I can draw from last night, is the moral that suicide is illegal. That's the legal part. Shameful. That's some of the cultural part. There's, of course, many different other dimensions to that moral. Ethics, in my discussion, will focus on the personal aspect, the individual aspect. With those, of course, there's no enforcement except your own act, because your ethics are your own. You enforce them. If you don't observe them, then in some way you can say they're not your ethic, right? So an example of that would be personally not wanting to become a brain-dead body on a hospital bed kept alive by machines. That can be your ethic, your value. And of course, I chose those two examples from last night's program and sort of the general theme of the symposium, but also to show that often morals and ethics, as I use those terms, can clash. One of the big organizing points of religion, especially authoritarian, but also much law and culture, is the intention to reduce those clashes by minimizing the difference between the public morals and what you reasonably might decide are your ethics. Of course, a lot of that involves coercion. We don't need to get into all the dimensions of that. Basically, these forms of authoritarian moral imposing involve structures that do everything they can to prevent you from having your own ideas about things. Of course, humanism is pluralistic. So by definition, we don't accept that notion. We don't accept the idea that the only possible ethic you can have is the social moral, the social rule, the public ethic. So then, thinking about pluralism, we can realize that one of the first ethics, or first public morals that has to be changed to foster pluralism is making sure that people have the right to talk about options. So we heard last night, a speaker from another culture describing how you can't talk about end-of-life issues. In this country, we can at least talk about it now. Of course, it took us a while to get here as well. So that's one important aspect of how you get to pluralism, but it also is an indication of how important that right to talk is for minorities like humanism, because we are a minority, and so we are organized around talking about changing public morals by talking, by raising issues, proposing new alternatives, expanding our horizons as humans. Equally, it shows the importance of the pluralistic worldview, because it essentially amounts to the right to a personal ethic, despite what public morals are. So, in reference to the journal, how do we derive what public policy, what public morals we want? Well, the answer, of course, is science and human values. For example, take for example the value of choosing to end your life when you're terminally ill. Example being, of course, the Oregon law. Values that many values can come into play, like the precious value of human life. Do you really want to give up any more of what you've got? So you can have things like that value, the value of, to the terminally ill person, of ending suffering, that sort of thing. And then there's science that comes to bear. Is the person competent to decide that they really want that? Is there a medical certainty of pending death from the terminal illness? Is there a danger of abuse by third parties? And of course, the laws, the public morals that are adopted result from a process that looks at values and science too. But we are doing the same thing as humanists with respect to using humanist values, not just values that other people in society might have. So say, for example, that law has passed. You're living in Oregon. You're terminally ill. You're definitely dying within 6 months. You're sane, so you qualify for ending your life under that law. That still leaves a lot of questions for you to answer that are not answered by the law, by the public moral. So that's where your personal ethic comes in, and humanism has to talk about those choices as well, not just the public ones, but your personal ones. They have to talk about them in a way that let you decide for yourself as an autonomous individual. They have to also, of course, be based in science and humanist values. So, to wrap things up, you can think about the values, for example, of considerations that would go into passing the law in the first place. Those transfer to the personal ethic decision and process. But there are also other values because there are other questions. So it might even be the value of your insurance policy. If you commit suicide using this law, will you lose your insurance? Will your survivors lose your insurance policy? Things like that can be values that you have to think about. And there's more, but then of course on the science side, there's the question maybe of whether the science of whether your depressive mother can take it for you to die from unnatural causes, quote unquote. The science of what the effects would be of you deciding to go public, for example, like the example of Brittany Maynard in Oregon. It was pointed out last night that people tend to copy other people. So that can both affect whether you personally decide to do it at all, but also how you do it. You might want to do it in a way that doesn't encourage depressive people to take your example, only people who truly are sick and needing the benefit of the law. And so you get this interplay, and by working those two things together, you can derive the public and private personal moral ethics that naturally arise from humanist values. That's what we try to do in the journal, and that's why we want you all to subscribe and to read it. So, thank you very much.